Hi, everybody. This is David Bernstein. I'm founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm delighted to be with you today to have a dialogue on race and racism. I don't know about you, but I've been in many dialogues over racism, and I've always been very frustrated that they tend to be very bifurcated. Either either people sort of want to have one view or they have another one, and you can very rarely have nuanced conversations that might actually try to thread the needle or might provide a third way. So I'm hoping that I can model a dialogue and discourse today around race and racism that you might not often hear, and that we can try to replicate these models in our broader discourse in society. I'm really delighted, and I hope he's on. I don't see him yet. To have Jeff Kass. Oh, there's Jeff. Jeff is a longtime friend. Jeff and I have known each other for probably 45 years or so. We're both from Columbus, Ohio. We both grew up within a couple miles. We grew up a couple miles from each other. We both went to Ohio State. Our parents knew each other. We were in the same BBYO chapter. So we go a long time, go back a long time. Jeff and I probably agree on most political issues and have always agreed on most political issues. But in recent years, Jeff became a very prominent attorney. He became a novelist, and he became a media and columnist. And I noticed that we had some difference of opinion on race and racism. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to explore some of that, also to explore what we have in common, and to see where this conversation goes. So Jeff, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and excited to have this important conversation.
Great. So I want to start on what we agree on, because I think that there's some fundamental values that we agree on. And if we can agree on those values, then I think it's easier to figure out where we might disagree and what might underlie some of those disagreements. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, we agree that America has a long history of racism, from chattel slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. And neither of us denies the importance of this racism in American life. Do you agree with that?
Fair. Yeah, that's
okay.
fair.
Okay. We agree that America has unfinished business on racism and race, and that our legacy of racism implicates America to addressing the disparities and prejudices that still exist in the country.
Yep, absolutely.
We agree that there's still racism in this country. That I even would say, and I know some people, even my own sort of ideological camp, might disagree, that there's still systemic racism in certain institutions in this country, right? You agree that we agree that there's racism.
Absolutely.
We also agree that the importance of discourse and dialogue around these issues, that we have to make sure that different voices are heard, that we don't want to crowd out anybody's voice, because that doesn't lead anywhere good.
No, and I think that's a critical thing why we're here today, is because we have to learn. I think we have to, as my dear friend Dr. Ryan Ross once said, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but part of that is having difficult conversations.
Right. And so the question is, I'm sure different things make us uncomfortable, and let's explore some of that. So you've written, Jeff, about the difference between, in your view, prejudice and racism. And it's something that I've heard for decades in the discourse, but it's one where we might not agree. Tell me, in your own view, what the difference between prejudice and racism is, and how you define racism in that sense.
Well, I mean, we're all human beings, so we all have the capacity to hate others. We all have the capacity to be prejudiced. We all have the capacity to not like the way somebody looks and be prejudiced that way. But just because, for example, I might, do something to somebody else that's based on that prejudice, doesn't mean that person is impacted on a more societal level. It doesn't mean that if I act in that way, the person's going to lose their job or have less pay or have no access to housing or be treated unjustly in the criminal justice system. So when you use the word ism, when you use that little part ism signifies a system. Judaism, for example, is the system of the Jewish religion. communism is the system of the communist theology. So racism is a system of prejudice that's based on race. I don't want to get hunkered down on semantics. To me, there is a deep structural racism in this country. But when I distinguish between prejudice and racism, it's really that, listen, a black person can be prejudiced or have hateful tendencies towards somebody who's white and white versus black, but then what's the larger effect of that? And that's how I distinguish between racism, which is more structural and systemic, and prejudice, which we all can suffer from.
Right. Yeah, and I think I challenge that distinction that you're making. Of course, let's start here. I agree that some prejudice or racism, and I would call it racism, is more consequential than other kinds of racism. Not all anti-Semitism, by the way, is equally noxious. You know, someone can say he Jewed me down in the marketplace, and I say that's an anti-Semitic remark, and somebody could try to beat me up because I'm Jewish, and that's a much more severe expression of anti-Semitism. So it's not like I believe all forms of prejudice or racism or anti-Semitism are equal. Some are definitely more consequential than others. But I start to get nervous about this idea that certain people can be racist. And I don't mean to make it just a semantic debate, because it really does go into how we think about the issue of power. So I would argue that it's not so clear cut that whites are part of a power structure all the time. I mean, obviously that's the case some of the time, or that blacks aren't. While that's the case some of the time, that isn't the case all the time. There are blacks in certain contexts who have power, and there are whites in other contexts who don't have power. I do believe that a black person's prejudice can be actually quite consequential. So I might say, for example, if it's becoming increasingly common that black people in a certain area, let's say a certain neighborhood, are anti-Asian, and there's anti-Asian sentiment going on in parts of the black community, and increasingly there are Asian people being beat up, that is to me highly consequential. And in that instance, you could also argue that the black people who have those attitudes are actually exercising a kind of power.
Yeah, but where I disagree with you is, I mean, you can always cherry pick some very discrete and narrow issue, but on a larger societal scale, there's no, again, this is why I want to focus on the ism part of the racism. There's no system in place, structural or systemic, that is where black folks are keeping the white folks down and not allowing them to have access to housing, education, pay increases, opportunity. I can go down the list. Fair treatment in the criminal justice system, fair passage of laws that treat black and white folks the same. So, but I am concerned about getting bogged down on semantics. So I'm willing, for the purposes of discussion, to say that a person who is not white can be racist with a lowercase r. That, in other words, they hate somebody based on race. If we need to go there. But I still want to make sure we have this distinction between structural and systemic racism versus lowercase r racism, because that's the real point of the discussion, which is there is a humongous difference. I've been subjected to anti-white behavior from black folks, and while it was upsetting and I was distraught and it was unfair and it was unjust, I still went home to my nice suburban home, and I still had access to the same job. I can live wherever I want. I can travel wherever I want. I don't have those same impact. So there is a difference on that. Kind of like, I'll give you an example, kind of like why we have hate crimes. When there's somebody does a regular criminal activity, they go to jail for a certain amount of time. If there's a additional thing on top of it because it was based on race or anti-Semitism or something like that, we give them more jail time. Why? Because the impact isn't just on the person they committed a crime against. It's really impacts the entire community, their crime, because it puts fear into so many people's lives. So racism, capital R, has a much broader effect.
Yeah. Well, by the way, if that were the case, hate crimes also can be committed against Jews, right? There's enhanced penalties for any for any group based on race or racism. And by the way, I think under most hate crimes laws, even a hate crime against a white person because the person was white would constitute a hate crime. But I think we're getting too much into the weeds here, and it can end up being a semantic debate. And maybe we ought to start moving into this area of what is systemic racism? What does it explain? What doesn't it explain? And here's where I think we might get into some areas of disagreement, and I think it could be very valuable disagreement because so let's go there a little bit. First of all, try to define, and I think you started to, but define systemic racism for us.
Well, I mean, and this is the difficulty because systemic racism today isn't the same as it was 30 years ago or 50 years ago. But systemic racism really is when the laws of our country have been developed in a way that seeps into our system so much that race becomes kind of the impact of those laws. And that happens in the past. They would literally draw lines. You can't live here if you're black. The city of Ladue years ago in St. Louis, near St. Louis, Missouri, turned out they had a actual policy of pulling over black people when they're driving in certain neighborhoods. The FBI in the 90s did a study of the Illinois state troopers were pulling over black people more. Those are kind of how systemic racism. Today, a lot of times things seem facially race neutral, but in fact, they prevent, for example, multi-dwelling households when you start getting closer to white neighborhoods to prevent, people of color that come into those areas. But it really has to do with how our legal system is set up. A very recent example, of course, is, we know there's mass incarceration of black men in this country, and we know that the same type of drug that was being sold on Wall Street, that was being sold in the inner city. Wall Street got a different punishment for what was happening in the black areas. That's a form of systemic racism. Okay.
So let's stop there for a second because I think there's a lot to talk about there. First of all, I think we're going to agree. I think we do agree that there was systemic racism in this country's history. Redlining, which you talked about, is one example of that. Interestingly, though, and I think it's always more complicated, that they looked at some redlining areas and they found out that 80% of the people who lived in redline districts were white people or were non-black people. Now, however, 97% of blacks were redlined. So the question that you have to also ask is, what does that mean today? In other words, sometimes redlining is not just talked about as something that was done in the past, which it was, and it was largely motivated by racism. But that, although there are people who would argue that it was just in some cases a way of minimizing risks that banks would take. Leave that alone because clearly it was used in some instances as racism. The question, though, we have to ask ourselves is, what does that mean today? In other words, because there was redlining practiced, let's say 30s and 40s and 50s, do we still view that as a category of systemic racism today? Before we go, okay, why don't you start? Because I wanted to go to criminal justice, but if you want to tackle that for a second, go ahead.
Well, I think we have to look at two things. We have to look at from slavery to really the 1970s, when when you literally, and you could argue even into the 90s with certain laws, but how does that still impact today? And I think that's this question here, which is you can't prevent people from creating wealth in this country. You can't mass incarcerate them intentionally. You can't take away parents from children. You can't segregate them, deny them education and opportunity, and then press a magic button and say it's not going to impact today. So even if we only look at the past, you still have to address the effects of that. And then today, which I know we want to get into, I think you have to backwards this, which is to say we have massive gaps in education, housing, wealth disparity. You can go down the list. And then why is that still the case today? How much it can be assigned to the past and how much can it be assigned to the present?
Right. And we have to, yes, and we're going to go there. But I would argue ultimately that people did move. In other words, there are a lot of places that were very poor, that were redlined, that large numbers of people just moved out of, right? A lot of black people moved out of it. I think we have to remember that today more than 2/3 of black people are living in the middle class or above. It's not like everybody is stuck in a state of poverty that was created during times of redlining. That's clearly not the case. We've seen tremendous upward mobility in this country. Doesn't mean that there aren't disparities that need to be addressed. Doesn't mean that there aren't problems that need to be solved. But again, I think that there might be a statute of limits on the power of an explanation. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any explanatory power left. But I think you have to ask yourself today, yes, it's true. There were a lot of things done, including, by the way, the ability to amass wealth. Those things have ongoing implications, but they don't explain everything. And we have to sort of put them in their proper place and allow them to be discussed. But I don't think treating them as if that's the last thing that was done or the most definitive thing that was done is also true, or also explains as much as it sometimes pretends to explain.
But I don't want to lead anybody on here to think that the black man or woman who has entered the middle class or the upper middle class in this country, somehow then we're now living in post-racial America for them, because I can tell you right now, it might be 100%, but certainly 99% of my black male friends have been asked to step out of their vehicle for speeding in this country. Now, that to have families not know if their father is going to come home at night just for speeding, I can tell you, you and I have never been asked to step out of our vehicle for speeding. We might have for other reasons, but not for speeding.
Let's come back to that, because we're going to another area, and I think I might partially challenge you, I might partially agree with you there. But let's move into this idea of systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Now, I've been involved in criminal justice reform for many years. I brought a major initiative, Jews for Criminal Justice Reform, to the Jewish community. It's something I believe strongly in, and I think that there are disparities that need to be addressed. However, I'm sometimes reluctant, and I think it's the case in some instances, but I'm sometimes reluctant to call that systemic racism. Sometimes there is systemic racism in that, and sometimes there's just disparities in the criminal justice system that need to be addressed. So, for example, you mentioned the drug laws and how, let's say, white cocaine was cocaine that whites generally consumed versus the crack cocaine epidemic that we saw, let's say, in the late 80s and the early 1990s. The criminal justice system treated those two drugs vastly differently, and that's then viewed as a kind of systemic racism. So I want to point out two things that I think complicate that picture. One is that crack cocaine actually has a much more drastic impact on inner city communities than cocaine did. And so we weren't actually dealing with really the same drug. We were dealing with crack cocaine, which really devastated inner city communities. And I was just watching a documentary on that recently about how much crack cocaine devastated black communities, inner city black communities, in the 80s and 90s. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I would point out is that it was actually, if you go back to the 1990s, and we were both active politically then, it was really many black legislators, congressmen, so forth, who saw what was happening in their own communities and wanted to strengthen the crime laws. And it turns out that some of those pieces of legislation that we passed to strengthen crime laws had disparate impact in a way that we probably regret now, including probably some of those same legislators. I mean, Bill Clinton was one of the people who led the charge. I don't think he understood the impact that would have on the black community and many black communities, and he now regrets much of it, right? So I think we have to change some of those laws, but I don't think they're necessarily categories of systemic racism. I think they created impacts that we didn't understand then that have affected the black community in ways that were profoundly different than we understood.
Okay, but again, and sometimes we get bogged down on how much intent was placed on. I mean, some people could have had intent to do things. Other people could have been oblivious. Some people could be operating under, false presumptions. But the end result is a system that unfairly treats black people. And, I'm glad we're talking about the drug problem, because there's pretty high evidence that during the Iran-Contra mess, that our government was heavily involved, our Secret Service was heavily involved in paying for those things through direct dealing of drugs into the Black community. Now, whether that came from the President of the United States or whether it was, but there's plenty of articles and research done on, we never stopped the flow of those drugs which are being used in the Central America to fund some of the activity against the communists in Central America. And those drugs, whether it came from the top, we don't have evidence of that, but we certainly knew what the drugs were coming in, and we didn't do anything to stop it. So there's definitely a government, either blind eye or direct participation. And then second, we all were aware of the problem that was taking place. And, this really became evident to me when I volunteered once at a maximum security prison. And I was talking to somebody that was in prison for 30 years for doing a violent act. And his story is not unlike many others, which was when he was a juvenile, he saw his father, who was on drugs, hurting his mother. He stabbed his father in the back. Instead of getting him the help he needed as a kid who was just trying to defend his mother, he was put into the system. And then later, the system continued to promote him as a criminal, and he did more criminal acts as later on in life. We never got the people who were affected by the drugs help. Instead, we just mass incarcerated him. Right. And that overwhelmingly impacted Black people. And so it became systemic in that regard. So whether there's somebody directing it like a puppet at the top or not, it's still systemic.
Well, it's just, we have a systems problem. I think we agree on that. Whether it's systemic racism or not is a different question in my view. And I think there are examples, don't get me wrong, of systemic racism in the criminal justice system, but I don't think they're as frequent. And I do believe, by the way, that intent does matter, or you're dealing with something different than systemic racism. In other words, the fact that there is disparate outcomes in a community doesn't mean that those outcomes were specifically aimed at Black people. It just means that they had a larger impact in certain communities, and more vulnerable communities than in others.
Would you agree, though? Would you agree with this? Would you agree that if we show that the mass wealth gap, the education gap, the housing gap, the criminal gap, and we gap, we can go down every aspect of society, that it is worth doing a deep dive on looking at those systems to see whether they have vast racially disparate impact, and the need to change those systems so they stop having that impact?
Sure, of course. I'd also say, though, that sometimes when you look at a system like, let's say, disparate income outcomes in healthcare, and you look at the studies, and they're sometimes reported as sort of an example of systemic racism, you actually, oftentimes, if you control for income and wealth, you actually find that they're a function of wealth and income. In other words, poor people suffer greater health consequences than rich people.
But then you have to look at, why is there such an income and wealth gap and education gap? These things cannot be looked at in a vacuum. They have to be looked at.
But okay, so then you're drilling down on why there's differences in wealth gap. Look, I have to tell you, though, that then you don't answer all the questions there, because you also find that, for example, Nigerian immigrants who are Black are doing better in this country than almost every other ethnic community, including whites. They're actually outpacing Asian Americans in average educational achievement. Now, I'm saying that if systemic racism was the problem, in other words, if it was the overriding problem, you would expect to see that impact Nigerian immigrants who are doing, as we said, exceedingly well. So I think there has to be other things going on there besides just racism.
Yeah, there's a generational trauma that starts when a child is born. And those Nigerian immigrants don't have that same generational trauma that we have here.
Agreed.
And I don't think it's fair to say a very discrete and, frankly, a very small group of people compared to the larger population. And it's not that those Nigerians don't experience racism in this country. They do. But I don't think it's fair. There's a very different experience that they've had to live with in this country, and their parents had to live with, and their grandparents had to live with.
Now we're getting somewhere, because I agree that there is a generational trauma that exists when you're a black person. You grew up, and we're not that far away from slavery, right? We're not that far away from Jim Crow. I mean, it's only been since the early 1960s that we had the civil rights law. So until that time, we had Jim Crow in place. But the thing is, when you start to talk about the collective trauma, then you have to say, okay, how do we address that trauma? How do we address the effects of that trauma that continue to plague the parts of the black community, some parts of it more acutely than others? So Orlando Patterson, he's a sociologist at Harvard. He's been talking about these issues for many years. And he says, look, I mean, there are places there are parts of the inner city, not the entire inner city. The inner city is a complicated area. There are a lot of church-going people, for example, that have a specific kind of culture. But there are other parts of the inner city where you see sort of this trauma have its greatest weight. And I think if we're talking about how to lift up people, we have to deal with that trauma, and not just the idea that it's coming from an external source. In other words, it might have come from it did come from an external source. Chattel slavery was one of the most disgraceful and high impact forms of attack on human beings ever. So it's not like it stripped them of their culture, of where they came. It's a horrible institution. So there's no question that had profound impact on black people, and would of anybody who went through it. The question is, what do we attribute it to today, and are we solving for the right problem?
So I think, we cannot, what you're saying is 100% accurate. We need to look at the generational trauma as one component of this, but this problem is so gigantic that we can't just say, oh, well, the past caused all this generational trauma, so we need to address that. And then, maybe today is not so bad. Today is so bad, and I can tell you blind studies that have been repeated over and over again in this country show that even in elementary school, where they've taken 80% of the teachers in public school systems are white, although certainly black folks can suffer from this too in terms of their biases. And over 50% of the public school system is black or Latino. And what they've done is, even on math tests, they've shown that when they blind change the names of the people on the tests, and they give them to teachers to ask them who has the most aptitude for growth, and that they've shown when they change to white-sounding names like Todd versus black-sounding names like Sharice, the Sharices still get the worst aptitude growth remarks, even when they've changed the results. And this has been repeated many times. Rosenthal, who did this study in the 60s, which is the foundational research, even showed when you have teachers that will think that you have the aptitude for growth, and when they give you the encouragement, that you actually have IQs went up when the teachers and the people who were teaching them believed in them. And they've done studies after studies which show that teachers don't call on black students the same. They don't look in their direction. They get disciplined harsher. And so, again, this is a discrete issue, but to somehow suggest that there's no systemic problems out there, and that we only should look at generational trauma, this starts at
But I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing that I think that sometimes we only deal with systemic problems.
In other words, look at both, but
you have to look at both, because and the question is, okay, how prevalent are both? That's a fair question, and we should delve into that. That's where I believe that the discourse should be, because it'll help us solve problems better. But let me give you an example. Look, I don't know about every study that you're citing, and I'd have to look at them one by one. But one thing I found is, when I've interrogated some of the studies that have been out there, I found that they are always a little bit more complicated than you would think. So let me give you one. The other day I was questioning the issue of systemic racism when someone, not the existence of it, but a manifestation of it, when somebody shared with me this study that I had read about before about resumes. Now, there was a large scale study. I think there was something like 80,000 resumes where they put out there where they had black names traditionally black names, surnames and first names, and more commonly associated white names, and they use those resumes to apply for certain jobs, and in every other respect, the people had the exact same experience. And it's often cited that it was the resumes with black people that got looked at less. So I was very interested in that study, and it turned out there was something like a 3% differential. So it was not a huge differential. It was even a little less than 3%, if I recall correctly. Which could be in the margin of error, but let's assume it didn't. When you actually looked at the data more closely, you realize that almost all the places where that looked at white names more seriously than black names, there were about 20% of the places, 80% of the sample did not actually look at black names more critically than they did white names, and so that starts to say to me, well, maybe there's institutional racism in certain companies and organizations that are causing that disparity. So by saying that, instead of me looking at it as a societal-wide problem that's just huge, that's everywhere, that's in the water, that's in the oxygen, I can say, wow, there are 20% of these companies that they looked at that actually have an institutional problem, and now I can solve for that.
So that brings up an interesting, I don't know the study, so it's hard for me to comment on a study that I'm not familiar with. I do know there are plenty of, and this really gets to the word empathy. We forget, this is probably the biggest problem in this country, next to not being able to have conversations like we're having, but it's also, we forgot how to have empathy. And it's time that, and I think this is a real problem for everybody, but white folks in particular who do get more benefits of a society where they don't have that same generational trauma. They don't have to deal with police in the same manner. That we need to start listening to the experiences of our brothers and sisters who are black and say, what has been your experience? So, for example, there's a woman who had a college degree in Atlanta, put her resume on monster.com. She had a black sounding name. She got very little traction. She changed her name to Jennifer. She got 80 different responses. Like, we can't dismiss that this happened to her. And that's really where we get to empathy. When people say, I don't think there's a major problem in the police department, and then I tell them about, I'm going to leave his name out of it. Let's call him Fred. I'll tell him about my friend Fred. This is a real incident. Who was pulled over in the St. Louis area for speeding. He was asked to step out of his vehicle. He was asked to have his car searched. The whole 9 yards. They took his bucket seats out of his car and left him on the side of the road because they didn't find anything. Again, I don't need to go through every example, but we need to listen to our black brothers and sisters and say, what are you experiencing? We can study each other to death. And I guarantee I can show you studies that go contra your studies, and you can show me other studies. There's always problems in studies, but we need to start listening and say, wow, we need to find out, why is that still happening to you? Why do my black friends need to tell their teenagers how to act when a police pulls them over, and I never needed to tell that to my kids?
Right. So a couple things. One, obviously, I agree that we should be listening to other people who have different experiences than ourselves. I mean, we're both Jewish, right? I've experienced anti-Semitism. I suspect you have as well. I'm qualified to talk about it in a way that maybe the average white person who's never even hasn't thought about it as much doesn't have the same experience. So if they listen to me, they have a sense of what I've experienced, and that can enhance their own understanding. I would say the same for a black person who goes through life being black, and what is that like? I should hear that out. But it is a data point, and data. Other forms of data are still very, very important. So, for example, there are a lot of studies that have actually even been conducted, by the way, by black social scientists. I mean, we have to understand that too. It's not like the studies have all been, written and conducted by racist white folks.
Wait, in all fairness, though, like, I don't like when people point out, well, this Jewish person said that Israel is, doing bad things, therefore, that it's a Jewish study. Like, you can always find somebody of a group to speak against another group. That's part my, yeah, of course. But what I'm saying, but I'm saying, well, look, what I'm saying is that the black community is actually quite diverse on these issues. Let me give you an example. Recent poll taken about affirmative action in higher education. Now, I happen to support affirmative action
some form of affirmative action in higher education. I can't imagine going to college and having very, very few black people. I would want my kids, or I wanted to be around a diverse group of students, right? But it so happens that 60 some percent of black people, according to this poll, oppose affirmative action in higher education. What that tells you is that the black community is much more politically diverse than sometimes we are giving them credit for. And they're not monolithic on these issues. They don't all do exactly what you're attributing. They don't all.
They're intelligent human beings who think through issues. And honestly, if it wouldn't be for the racist rhetoric of the right and there's good people on both sides and shithole countries and those kind of nonsense that you hear on the far right. Black people, of course, are politically diverse, but what they're not politically diverse on is not accepting, the kind of racism that comes out, especially in the last 4 years, even more so than ever, of the right. So,
no, look, we all, virtually every black person is going to recoil and be opposed to, a racist statement that comes from somebody. That's for sure.
The way I've always kind of, I've had deep discussions on these issues. But if you want to have those discussions, though, with your black friends, there needs to be a level of trust built up to know that we're not denying their experience. We're not denying some of the significant, still ongoing systemic and structural racism. That we're not denying that, because once we deny kind of their existence of how they live day by day, then to talk about like taxes, there's no trust.
Right. But Jeff, here's the problem with that is that we end up sometimes believing that there's racism in places where there isn't, or that don't explain what they pretend to explain. So, for example, there's been a lot of studies about black being killed by police officers. The truth is, and there's a lot of data on this, that black people are not killed at a higher rate in criminal situations than white people are. They are harassed at a higher rate. There was studies that show that. I'm not willing to ignore those studies in the name of lived experience. I'm not. And by the way, similarly, wait a second. I just want one other related point I'm going to turn to you. Similarly, I can say all that I want about me experiencing anti-Semitism as a Jewish person, but when the Pew survey shows that Jews are the most admired religious community in the country, I have to complicate my own view of anti-Semitism in America. So again, I'm not denying the importance of lived experience in discourse with people who have those experiences, right, so but I'm saying it has to be balanced.
I'm glad you brought up those statistics on the rates of police killing people. If you look at those statistics and take it into the unarmed human beings, the statistics get much worse. And that's because, and this is where, listen, we can easily, not easily, but we can better identify overt racism. When somebody says the N-word, when people, unfortunately, in our military are busting out Confederate flags, which is now against the military rules, when there's people that are doing overt things, a police officer does something bad and then we find out his Facebook account is full of, those are things we can identify and fire people. But now you're getting to really a topic that's near and dear to me, which is we also have to start delving into what is really unconscious internal bias in this country. And you could have a well-meaning person who goes through life not consciously feeling racist, but when they've been fed, and this includes police officers and teachers and judges, when they've been, and they include black people and white people, when you've been fed decades and decades of negative imagery about black people, and we had to wait till I was, 40, in my late 40s to get a black superhero. When we have these images, it seeps into us, and they've done studies where they show grandmas popping up, fake pop-ups when police shoot, how quickly they shoot. They shoot black grandmas quicker than they shoot white criminals in studies. So I'm just letting you know your statistics. I've read those on total number of people and rates of killing. But when you get to the unarmed part, black people fare much worse because there is that strong bias that we have in us. And when you're holding a gun, those biases can be very dangerous.
Right. Let's have a follow up conversation where we delve into some of these studies. Look, I don't know, and about the unarmed statistic. Perhaps somebody can find it and send it to Dan, who will then put it up on the screen for us. I think that would be if somebody out there has it and can share it with us, we could look into the study. But again, I'm prepared to believe that that's the truth. And I am sure that there is implicit bias in this country. I don't believe that implicit bias training works very well, by the way. And we've seen studies showing that over the years. I mean, there's been a series of studies that show that the training that we try to do around this in the workplace and other places doesn't work very well to actually change much.
There's one area it could, though. And this is really critical. In education, we already have a group of people who, in their heart, want so bad to help children. That's why they went into a profession that pays them almost nothing. And so they're doing this to help children, and they've shown on not on a study basis, but anecdotally, for example, when they've gone in and talked to teachers about, hey, I watched your class, you're not paying attention to the Black students, you're not calling on the Black students, and I know you mean well here. And teachers are much more open to making sure they're doing right by their children than maybe some other folks in society, because unlike my legal profession, which attracts a bunch of narcissists, we do have a teacher profession that attracts really good people who want to do good in this world. And I feel like that's a good starting place for this kind of training, to literally show how it manifests itself in classrooms.
Right. I suspect I would agree with that. I think I'd want to look at what models have been out there, what works, what doesn't work, what they've and examine that a little bit more. I sometimes think that we're just told that certain models work. I'm very skeptical of sort of the diversity, equity, and inclusion models that have been out there. I think that they tend to just stifle discourse. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good models out there that examine implicit bias in a way that could be productive.
I just trained a county government recently on unconscious bias issues that included police officers and healthcare workers. And the truth of the matter is, again, there's all kinds of training out there. I don't think there's one model for diversity and inclusion, but I don't think most diversity and inclusion models are really getting into unconscious bias. They're really talking about, you need to hire people, you need to give people more opportunity. If the system gets changed, but the people administering the system still have these deep biases, you'll only find incremental improvements. You will get more workers, but you really won't move the ball forward in the manner we need to. And so that's why I think we need to shift the focus on that particular part. I don't think that's been a big part of DEI issues.
Yeah, well, there's been all kinds of models. Implicit bias has been very much part of workplace training and human resources and the like. That often administer the implicit bias test and so forth. But let's get away from that for a second, because you mentioned education, and obviously a lot of the discourse and discord that we've seen are on issues of education. You have parents and individuals who claim that critical race theory is being taught in schools around the United States, and that is teaching an incorrect or racially essentialist view of racism in this country. And you have others who insist that it's not even being taught at all, and that we're just teaching the truth about racism. Where do you come in on that?
Well, I mean, I hate when I hear words like K through 12. I'm not going to talk to a kindergartner about the racial social construct of race. That doesn't make sense to talk to a kindergartner about that. Right. On the other hand, I think we've done a big disservice by, not teaching our kids, especially as they get into the older years of their education, about the social construct of race and how systemic racism works. I agree. I'm open to people giving all kinds of views on the topic, because I think ultimately that's where our First Amendment comes from, is that the best views are going to win out someday. Just like, we used to have an anti-gay country. We used to have separate. Eventually, those naysayers always lose in the end. If you notice the pendulum, we always become more open over time, because those naysayers were wrong all along. So this is another example. It's a difficult thing because it makes people feel uncomfortable. I'm not of the opinion we should just go into classrooms and say, listen, all you white people, you're all a bunch of racists. I don't think that's effective, whether it's true or not. I just don't think it's effective. But I do think we need to talk about, listen, it's a fact. Prior to slavery, the word race was barely used in the English language. U.S. slavery was the first time that we had a slavery system that was almost exclusively based on race, and the whole hierarchy leading through Jim Crow and segregation and all the way through the present. That is really where racial construct and the Enlightenment period, even in I don't even know why they call it Enlightenment when I read more and more quotes, but even philosophers like Immanuel Kant and they were talking about how, Black people are an inferior race, and that's how kind of we built our entire slavery system on this idea. So I think to not talk about, I love when people say, oh, there's only one race, the human race. Well, that was true until about the year 1500. And now it's not true anymore. And so to not say that our society was kind of built on this racial construct, I do want that taught to the kids. I do want them to know. But I think it needs to be done in a way where we just delve through these issues. And I think important in that process, and this really, people don't even know what CRT is. Critical race theory is 40 years old. It was a legal analysis. It wasn't an educational analysis. And but piggybacking on CRT, I think we need to talk about true history. We need to talk about not just not just slavery, but the contributions of Black people. Let's not leave them out of the discussion.
Sure.
Let's not leave Africa out of world history like it was when you and I went to the same high school. We didn't have African history, but we learned about the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution.
Right. I don't remember that either, by the way, but that might be. I'll take your word on it that we learned about the Russian Revolution. But it's possible. Okay, so there's an anti-racist audit that is being conducted in the Montgomery County public school systems in Montgomery County, Maryland, home of over 100,000 Jews. Also a very diverse area, by the way, unquestionably a very diverse area. In it says that they're going to advise the social studies curriculum of the future to teach students to recognize and resist systems of oppression. Now, I have to tell you, I find that highly problematic. Not because I don't think that there are systems of oppression out there, but because I don't want teachers to tell my kids precisely what they are. In other words, I want there to be a debate about it. If you want to tee up somebody who's writing about a system of oppression like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram X. Kendi, and then you want to share with them people who critique those people, and you want to allow a discussion on what constitutes a system of oppression, I'm all in. And I would love my kids to have that discussion and debate. But if you're going to tell my kids precisely how racism manifests itself in American society today, and you're not going to it's not an argument, it's not taught critically, but it's taught as a set of facts, I'm going to tell you that I think that's highly problematic, and I'm going to oppose that. Now, I agree that we have to teach and do justice to the history of racism in this country. We can't, yes, it is true that American democracy articulated the greatest human ideals that have allowed other countries, by the way, to practice democracy. And that's part of our story as well. But it's also true that some of those same people practice chattel slavery. And it's hard to make sense of, but we have to at least put that in front of people and let kids struggle with what that means. And they should know about all of those historical events and give an interpretative framework for it. But when you get to the contemporary age, we don't all agree on what precisely ails America today. We don't agree. We're arguing about some of those things now. And I want my kids to have the same argument that we are now in their classrooms and not be told exactly what to think.
So there's two components to this. Obviously, for example, Colorado just passed a law a couple years ago to mandate Holocaust education in the schools, and I'm in favor of that. It's a fact that it happened, and people who say otherwise are obviously hateful and have those same type of laws should be in place for teaching the deep systemic and horrible racism of slavery from the 1500s through literally into mass incarceration. Those are history. Those are facts that happened. They should know about that. this is a difficult area because in my world, it is a fact that there's systemic deep oppression in this country. So to say, oh, you shouldn't teach it as a fact, that's like La La Land, and it's not listening to. And I don't think everybody who opposes that is like somehow racist or that they're intentionally. I want to keep black people down. I think there's many good people that would disagree with that, but I still think they're wrong. But
let's go to the Holocaust, for example, for a second.
Let me just think.
Look,
this is where it gets into. It's really difficult to legislate teaching method because I think it should be taught as a fact, but we have many good teachers out there that know how to teach in a way that allows students to voice their opinion and to talk about things and to delve into these things. So I don't know how you legislate that on a individual teacher basis.
Yeah, well, there's no question that the way things get played out in the classroom can often be very different than what's in the curriculum. I mean, anybody who has kids in schools realizes that they can be taking the same history class down the hall, and actually the teacher's teaching it in a very different way. But even within things like the Holocaust, of course we all know that the Holocaust happened. That's a fact. But we also can interpret what happened in the Holocaust sometimes differently. For example, Daniel Goldhagen believes he was a writer and a social scientist. Believed that the average German was highly complicit. He called it, his book was Hitler's Willing Executioners in the murder of 6 million Jews, right? There are other historians that actually believe that that's not the case, and they make arguments to why that wasn't the case, that actually most Germans weren't aware of what was going on and didn't share in the anti-Semitism of the Third Reich. That is an interesting discussion about the Holocaust. It's not about whether it existed or not, but it gives you plenty of room for interpretation. I took a class from a very well-known philosopher named Emil Falkenhayn, who argued that the Holocaust was an unprecedented and unique event in human history. That is an interesting discussion to have. And having that debate does not in any way demean the Holocaust. And in fact, it elevates it in some ways. And I'm going to argue that even within slavery and and Jim Crow, there's discussions that are important discussions about their meaning and how to interpret them. And so I would like to make sure that these conversations are taught, but that we do as little prescribing as we possibly can and allow for different people to interpret them different ways, allow teachers some latitude in how they think of them. Don't give them this theology of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because what's happening is that teachers are being saturated in this ideology in these training sessions, and then they're told to integrate this in the classroom in various ways. And they are, in fact, stifling conversation. I can tell you from my own kids' experience that they're being taught very specific views about race and racism on a constant basis. And it's not up for debate. It's not up for discussion. And that's what I'm afraid is actually happening now. That is problematic.
This is a really difficult discussion because while I agree with you in principle that the best way to learn is to have robust discussions. I mean, you and I have had these discussions. We were debating, in high school over issues.
Yeah.
And so there's no question that the best growth happens through robust discussions. All of that is true. The problem gets into there is a large segment of this country, and whether it's explicit or implicit causes of their biases, that is wholly unwilling to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism. You and I disagree on the extent of it. I'm not sure where you stand, but we disagree on the extent of it, but you have acknowledged in this that there's some of it. So that becomes difficult because there are certain parts that are just fact. And to somehow go in there and say, some people say systemic racism doesn't exist. Some people say it does exist. that's sort of like saying
I wouldn't necessarily have the conversation on that level, but I think you can look at different examples and expose people to different viewpoints, valid viewpoints. I'm not talking about some idiot, who has a Fox TV show and denies the existence. I think there are really smart people that take different views on these issues, and we should expose them to those alternative perspectives. Look, there's other definitions of systemic racism that are catching on. For example, this idea of whiteness and the idea that there's a white dominant culture, and so therefore things like promptness is a function of institutional racism because it is an outgrowth of a white dominated culture. Now, you could say, oh, that's just actually something on the fringes. That is actually in the African American History Museum in America. I mean, that is increasingly in the curriculum of kids' schools. That is, I've heard educators talk about that as if it's a fact. And I'm saying that I think that's a terrible way to have the conversation. I'm not even saying it's not a valid viewpoint. I think it's not,
because it is a white dominated culture, but I'm not disagreeing with you. How we teach our kids is critically important. I'm in favor of the robust debate. I think there needs to be a baseline. Usually the extremists, of course, are the loudest always in the world. And listen, there are people in critical race theory advocates that are deeply anti-Semitic, but they have nothing to do with the actual idea. That's their own nonsense. And so I don't want to get sidetracked on a few extremists. What I do think it's critical that we put in our school systems that kids are taught about systemic racism, that they're taught about how race was constructed, and they're taught about the deep impact that this has had on our Black brothers and sisters. And so if we can agree that that is a starting point, I'm all in favor of bringing in different viewpoints to discuss those and have that be part of the curriculum. I'm just not in favor of what it is today, which is, by the way, nobody was passing laws when we didn't teach any of this stuff before. Like when we just had a white dominated history and we didn't talk about racial construct and we didn't talk about any of this stuff, nobody was passing laws at that time to say, cut it out.
Yeah, look. By the way, I don't know about you, but I remember going back. I think it might have been in 4th grade, watching Roots the first time, and learning about the history of slavery. I still remember that movie from sitting in that classroom and watching the, I think, 7-part or 8-part series that was Roots. I believe I was taught about slavery. I'm not saying we went nearly deep enough or long enough with it, and I'm not saying that there wasn't a one-sided narrative that we're taught about America that needs to be complicated. I just don't want to replace one ideological narrative with another ideological narrative. I'm not looking to do that. I'm looking to make people critical thinkers. And so, yes, of course, now that there's a reaction to it, I'm not saying that those same people who react to the teaching of critical race ideologies in schools would have done it if there was a white-dominated narrative that was also unfair.
Yeah, because they're not interested. By the way, those people,
so what?
Those people who are opposing critical race theory in schools are not interested in critical thinking. That's the problem.
So, some of them are and some of them aren't.
And I'll tell you,
look, I am, and I work with a lot of other people who are. In other words, yeah, and by the way, it's fascinating. I just read an article about Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the center of the culture war on critical race theory. And you had, by the way, a lot of African American parents who do not like teaching their kids that the system is rigged against their kids. They worry that it's going to have ill effects on their kids. But more than that, there were people interviewed in these stories that said, I'm not against teaching the history of racism to my kids. I just don't want to be taught this one narrative about disparity and this lacking in complicated thought, lacking in alternative viewpoints. I believe that's actually what's happening, Jeff. It's not like they're just, okay, we're just going to teach that there's systemic racism in American history and maybe some present examples. We'd probably, if the two of us sat around in a room for a week, we'd probably come up with an agreed upon narrative that should be taught to kids. But I think it's actually gone off the rails. And we're teaching kids things that are highly opinionated and highly open to dispute.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll agree that, first of all, I think the discussion in the news might sometimes go off the rails, but actually what's happening in school systems today, I don't think they've moved the ball yet to really discuss these things on a deep level. I don't think kids are still being taught kind of these important issues. I think we fundamentally agree on the need to have robust discussion, the need to bring in different viewpoints. But I do think, again, you can probably find a few people that are truly interested in critical thinking. But I think the majority of people who are trying to keep this discussion out don't want their kids to be taught that Thomas Jefferson has black descendants. They don't want to be taught that George Washington made sure that his cook did not stay in Pennsylvania for longer than 120 days so that he didn't get his freedom. They don't want to know that Thomas Jefferson said horribly racist things, despite their proclamations and legal documents. They don't want to know these things.
Yeah, and many of the people who are trying to teach these things don't want you to know that there are people within the black community who are challenging some of these core precepts. They don't want to teach John McWhorter. They don't want to teach Glenn Lowry. They don't teach Coleman Hughes. They don't teach any alternative perspective either. So I think we can agree that across the board ideologically, there's a lack of critical thinking. And in some ways, maybe what I'm looking to do is scale critical thinking in society and make sure we do it in a way that's also shows some empathy and respect to our past.
But then this really is such a difficult, because I don't want I don't want perspectives like the guy who wrote the bell curve to be in my classroom.
Yeah, of course.
How we decide what to put in that classroom becomes a very difficult. I'm not in favor of obviously book burning or anything like that, but we cannot deny the deep fundamental race problems in this country. And if the starting point is we're not denying that, and if the starting point is we have a baseline, there's a deep problem, there's generational trauma, and there's current systemic racism. If that's the starting point, I'm okay with robust.
It's not right. But it's not the only starting point. The starting point that there also, by the way, is a problem in Chicago where a lot of black people are killing other black people, and we have to be able to contend with those realities as well, and how to talk about those realities as well, and not pretend that doesn't exist.
Well, look, but that gets a little off topic. I mean, listen, everybody who lives in the same neighborhood kills more of their other. White people kill more white people in white neighborhoods. I mean,
right? Yes, but
not killing people because they're black.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous social problem in Chicago. Yeah, it has to be dealt with.
It's a crime problem. There's no such thing as black on black crime. That's absurd.
Why?
People always kill people in their own neighborhood.
Yes. But it's happening rampantly in Chicago in certain neighborhoods. By the way, there are probably, I'm guessing that I don't know the Chicago geography well. I'm sure there are middle class black neighborhoods in Chicago where there's very little crime. Right? So I'm not saying it's so maybe the term black on black crime is a little crude, but I'm saying but doesn't mean that there's not a very specific problem in a very specific part of Chicago where there's rampant crime and it's among black people. And I think we have to be able to talk about those things in an honest way. We are Jeff, we are running out of time. I think we should continue this conversation. There's so much more to talk about. I think there's some things we agreed on. And I think there's some things we still disagree on. We need to explore more. Maybe we'll take to writing some of these disagreements back and forth and see where we can come to agreement and see where we still.
No, I appreciate the dialogue, and I the one thing I would say is I know, having known you, and this is important for all of us, when you know somebody is coming from a place of genuine trying to get to the bottom of things, trying to solve our society's problems, I think it is important to have those discussions.
Right, and I agree the same with you. I think you want to solve society's problems. You're not trying to score points, and that's why we can have a conversation that probably on my part, at least, got a little too heated. So I apologize if that happened. But
totally fine. We're Jews. That's what we do.
That's what we do. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. It's 4:00. Shabbat shalom. Have a great day.